Hi everyone, it's Lindsay and I'm back today with another video on watercolor background with markers. Now I'll be using the Summer Basket stamp set from Inspired by Stamping. This is a great solid stamp set to do a quick card, or it's great to do some embossed resist, which is what I'm going to be doing today. So I've die cut a scalloped rectangle with a die, and I did use watercolor paper for that die cut. Now I'm using that Summer Baskets. It's like the little hanger. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the top right hand corner. I have went ahead and prepped my cardstock with my embossing bag. And I'm going to be using my Misty. This is the mini one. I'll be using my Misty to do my stamping. Since I'm stamping on watercolor cardstock, I'm going to be double stamping quite a few times just to make sure that I get it nice and covered and I get a nice solid stamping, because wherever I don't and it doesn't pick up and hold that embossing powder too, I'm going to get watercolor there. So you want to make sure you get a nice solid stamping. So once I get that first stamp down in the top right hand corner, I'm just using white embossing powder to go ahead and sprinkle that over the stamp. I use Versamarking to do my stamping. Sprinkled over that white embossing powder, and then I heat set it. Because I'm going to be overlaying stamps here, I wanted to go ahead and get it heat set. Most of the time I would wait until the end, but in this case it made more sense to go ahead and heat set as I went along. Now also with this stamp set comes a little chain. Now I'm going to put that up and make sure that it's connected to the top little hanging or the hanging portion that I've stamped. It's kind of hard to see because I did use white embossing powder here, so it's white on white, but in real life you get that shine and you can see where you're stamping here. So I connected that chain, and I also measured out to where I want my hanging basket to end. Now I'm going to need to do a little bit of masking whenever I connect the chain to other two chains to look like it's holding the basket up, but it's not too much masking. I can actually just use painter's tape. So once I get those stamped down, again, I'm going to be putting on my white embossing powder. If you wanted to, you could also use clear embossing powder here, or if you wanted to add a colorful embossing powder to this, that would work too. Just anything to make this resist that watercolor that we're going to put on later. So once I get my second coat of embossing powder on, I've got that first image. So things are going to stick to that. That's just how it is. You can prep your cardstock all you want. You're going to get some powder stuck to that. So just use a small brush and brush any away before you heat set. Because again, even though you want the embossing powder to resist, anywhere you don't want it to resist, you need to remove the embossing powder before you get to the watercolor part, because it will leave little white marks on your paper if you don't. So here you can see I did have just a little bit of trouble stamping that chain, that first one. Once I got it done though, and the embossing powder is still stuck to that first stamp, I just used my brush again to remove that embossing powder. This is clear ink, so it's not going to show up, so it's not a big deal. Just brush it away and move on. So included in the stamp set are a lot of fillers that you can use to fill up the basket, or there's also a pot in there too. I'm going to be using the Boston Fern images. So there's two different ones. They face opposite directions, so you can fill up both sides of the basket. You can switch them around and make it look more full without using the same stamp over and over. But to do this, I did go ahead and mask off just the top of that basket with a piece of painter's tape very quickly. Now if I were to leave this open, that would be okay, but whenever I have that double layer of heat embossing where some of the fern is going to hit the basket, it's going to be a different height. It's going to be subtle, but it will be noticeable. So I just like to mask it off and make it all one smooth level surface. So I'm just finishing stamping some of these up, and again, I'm not doing any masking other than the basket. I'll remove that tape, sprinkle over my embossing powder, and then go ahead and heat set all this white powder. And you can see just how full that basket looks once I tilt the paper just right in the light. And for all of my embossing powder, I worked over a coffee filter. That allows me to just dump the embossing powder back into its little jar, screw on the lid, and throw that coffee filter away. There's really little cleanup, and while I'm working, I didn't have to do any cleanup as well. I just moved my coffee filter off to the side up to a shelf and went back to work until I needed it again. Now for this emboss resist technique and my watercolor background, the first thing I want to do is really wet the background of my cardstock here. So again, I'm using watercolor paper here. That's what I die cut to begin with. And I'm just really going to saturate this paper. I've got some clean water here. I've got a brush, and I've also got my palette off to the right hand side. Now, I ended up wanting quite a bit more color than I could get with my brush, so I did end up doing some ink smooshing here, and you'll see how I did that. Now for my color, I'm going to be using my Spectrum Noir Aqua brushes. If you don't have these, distress brushes, distress markers would work really well for this technique. Your zigs would work too. And just to give it a little bit of shimmer, I'm going to add some shimmer spray from Imagine Crafts. And this is the Sheer Shimmer Spritz, and it is in the color Frost. So I just give that a few squirts, mix it up with some water then, and that gives it just a nice little sheen to both of these watercolors. It's almost undetectable, but it's really pretty in real life. So I first started out with my brush, and I was just laying down color here, filling it in, dropping in drops here and there, making sure that I got it all around the images that I stamped, because what that stamped image is going to do is resist the watercolor. My paper will turn colors around it, but my images that I stamped will remain white. So that's how I'm going to get my images to show up with this white paper. So I'll continue dropping in these colors. I'm using a dark blue here and a dark purple. I'm doing the blue on top first, kind of a half and half here, and then I'll start dropping in my purple. I do want to clean my brush in between going back and forth between the colors at this point. Once all is said and done, it really didn't matter with this card, but at this point I wanted to keep my brush clean and my colors untouched from each other. So for this portion, again, I'm just using that brush, and you can see right in the bottom of that basket where it has those itty bitty lines, even that color is soaking up there. So you're really getting all the definition from these stamps. Now I wasn't getting enough color from my brush. I like really saturated colors. So I flipped my paper over and put it right down into my palette and did a little bit of ink smooshing. And this just allows me to really pick up that color, but it also allows me that control. So if I want a little blue in that corner, I can put a little blue in the corner just by dipping the corner in the blue. Now, whenever you're doing this, just make sure you use two colors that kind of play nicely together. You don't want something that's going to end up being mud whenever you mix the two colors together. So purple and blue play pretty nicely together. So that's why I use these two on this card. So you can see here I've got my background nice and saturated, and then I went ahead and overlaid a paper towel on top of that and just soaked up the remaining color that was on top. This is going to give it a nice pastel effect, but it's still really saturated with color, just a lighter color. Now whenever I lift this up, you'll also see that it picked up a little bit of those ridges from that paper towel, which gave it just a little bit more texture. It was a happy mistake that happened, but I do love the results. So whenever you're overlaying your paper towel, most paper towels have a design. Just be conscious of the design that you do have on that paper towel. And make sure it's going to go with your card. In this case it did, so it was a happy accident. But if it would have been maybe more flowers or something, that wouldn't have been so pretty. So for my sentiment, I went ahead and heat set and really made sure that that watercolor background was nice and dry. Then I popped this back into my Misty, put in the Friends sentiment set. I built up a sentiment that said, "So glad we're friends," and I stamped that right over my hanging basket and off to the left hand side as well. Then I'll bring back in that white embossing powder for a tone on tone look, and I'm going to heat set that sentiment right on top of that hanging basket. So whenever you're doing this, just make sure that you have went ahead and dried your background or gave it enough time to air dry. Either way, you want to make sure it's nice and dry before you move on to embossing a sentiment. Anything that's wet is going to pick up that embossing powder and hold on to it. Now you can use a brush to brush it away, but it's easier just to make sure it's nice and heat set and you don't end up with a completely white background covered with embossing powder. So I went ahead and sprinkled on some of that embossing powder. You can see I still have a few little stray flecks of it here and there, so I will use my brush. And I did use my embossing bag to prep this surface as well. Now I'll go ahead and use my heat tool and just give that a quick heat set. Now it looks like it's going to be not enough contrast here for the sentiment to show up, but as you heat this embossing powder, it does darken up. It does go a more opaque white, so it ended up okay. Now, if you aren't a fan of stamping your sentiments over your stamped images, you could always add a banner on this card and that would work for your sentiment as well. Now I went ahead and added some adhesive to the back of this panel. I did add quite a bit because I used water on this. It's watercolor paper, and I heat set so many times with my embossing. My paper got a little warped. So in order to make sure it stays down on all four sides and I don't have any bulging up, I went ahead and used quite a bit of adhesive, and I'll just put this down on a rectangle that is gray that's just a little bit larger. I went ahead and put some adhesive on the back of those two panels together and put that onto an A2 top folding white card base. Then to finish this card off, I'm actually just going to add a few little liquid pearls, and this is the white opal liquid pearls, and I'll just scatter them around the finished card. The liquid pearls are a product that I've really come to love. These are great to add little pearl accents to your cards without having to store all the different sizes of pearls that you might want to use. You can make them any size you want. You can add as many or as few as you like, and it fits right in with my Nuvo drops and my enamel accents, those types of things. So I'm not taking up any more space than need be. Once I had those on, that finished off the card for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video tutorial, and as always, I will leave you with a few pictures. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a few different links you can click. The top will take you to a video that you might enjoy watching next. The bottom left will take you to the supply list for this card, and the bottom right will subscribe you to my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and happy crafting!